When I crouched to tighten the leaking valve, my son-in-law laughed. He leaned against the railing in his linen shirt phone in hand and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Careful, old man, don't drown the rental." The guest chuckled. Even my daughter looked away, pretending not to know me. Salt wind cut across my face, but I kept my hand steady on the wrench. I had spent 40 years repairing ship engines in storms rougher than his ego. He thought I was a plumber playing rich for a weekend. He didn't know the yacht beneath his loafers already had my name engraved on its hull. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. I felt the chill of the chrome in my palm and the familiar bite of a stubborn fixture. The body remembers what the mind pretends to forget. Turn a quarter. Pause. Listen to the thread. Do not force. The hull hummed softly with the marina, and the May sun slid along the water like a hand smoothing a bedsheet. Behind me came the low murmur of conversation, soft laughter, the clink of a glass against a rail. I breathed through my nose the way I used to on rough seas. Keep the hand steady, keep the mind clear. Evan stood close enough that I could smell citrus cologne and fresh laundry. He did that thing with his mouth which he calls a smile and I call a smirk. "You fix pipes, huh? Guess it runs in the family." My forearm tightened. I said without looking up, "No, it runs under ships." He snorted as if he had won something. Grace cleared her throat and then changed the subject with a brightness that hurt my ears. "The weather is perfect today. Mom would have loved this." Robert and Marianne were kinder people than their son. They stepped aboard carefully as though stepping into someone else's church. Robert ran a hand along the teak rail. "Beautiful workmanship," he said to no one in particular. I nodded without meeting his eyes. The valve surrendered a fraction and the drip slowed. The breeze flipped a corner of the napkin on the aft table. The brass cleat at my knee threw off a shard of light. I lifted the small adjustable out of the cavity and wiped the sweat line from my wrist. The harbor smelled of diesel and rope and old fish. A sound that is not a sound at all settled over me, the low thrum of rigging against masts up and down the slips. I stood and turned the tap to test. A single drop of fat and clear formed and fell, and then nothing. Good enough for now. Evan announced it like a ringmaster. "Look at that. Our handyman saved the day." He clapped twice for show. I stared past him toward the breakwater where small waves shouldered against stone. The first time I told Grace about the ocean, I called it a patient teacher. She was 6, and she had fallen asleep against my chest with a toy sailboat in her fist. We made our own little vessels out of cereal boxes back then and let them run in the bathtub. Later on, she learned to read tide charts. Then she learned to read rooms. Her eyes flicked over me now, quick and evasive, the way they do when she thinks silence is safer than truth. I set the wrench on the cloth and folded the cloth on the table. The cutlery was already in place for the little lunch I had prepared. Cold salmon, lemon, dill. I had thought the taste of home could soften a weekend that was about to test us all. The trick of life is what you withhold, and when. I had withheld the only fact that mattered today. Not to harm anyone, to see them. There is a difference. Evan glanced toward the helm. He was inventorying value in his head the way a man counts trophies. He swept a fingertip along the panel as if that gesture gave him possession. "You must have saved a long time for this," he said. I let my eyes rest on the water. Some things take time. His jaw moved. He did not like answers that did not praise him. Grace came to my side and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear the way her mother used to. "Dad, do you need anything?" I shook my head. She stared at my hands, and I saw that small flicker of shame I have come to know too well. She did not want to see me bent over a task. She wanted me seated so I would be invisible. Marianne placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulders and pulled him back a step. "Give your father-in-law a moment," she said. Her voice had the softness of linen left on a clothesline. We moved toward the cabin. The salon smelled faintly of cedar and glass cleaner. Light poured through the side windows in clean rectangles, and the table gleamed with polish, every fork aligned, every glass without a spot. Discipline is a kind of love. I learned that in the Navy, and I tried to teach it without making a sermon of it. Evan lingered upstairs, tapping something on his phone. The sound of his shoes faded and returned, faded and returned. Restless men make restless water around them even when the sea is calm. Robert paused at the photograph near the stairs, a small framed picture of Grace at 10 clutching a blue life jacket and grinning with missing teeth. He looked at me with a question he did not ask. I leaned in close enough for only him to hear. She used to love the water. He nodded once the way men do when the truth is not a secret, so much as a bruise. The meeting of any family is a kind of tide. It comes in and goes out and leaves different shells in the sand. We ate in the polished light and the conversation moved around me. Marianne asked about the marina fees and I let a harmless number hang in the air. Evan could not resist the bait. Expensive for a weekend playhouse, he said, and lifted his glass. The word stung not because of the cost, but because of the wordplay. Toy. Pretend. A man spends a lifetime working, and still a child will call him a child when he does not dress his money in neon. He leaned toward Grace and whispered loud enough to travel. Social Security buys miracles now. She gave him a look meant to be a warning, and he grinned at his lap. Robert set his knife down in a straight line beside his plate and took a measured breath. I finished chewing and let the fork rest. There is a way to call a halt without standing. There is a way to remain a gentleman while drawing a boundary. Evan stood up and stretched as if the room were a sweater he had grown out of. He said he would take a quick look below, not a request and not a courtesy. The steps carried his impatience into the corridor, and I heard a door open and shut. Grace put her face in her hands for a second and then smoothed her hair as though the gesture could smooth a marriage. She wanted so badly for everyone to be all right. I lifted my palm to my pocket and felt the cool oval of the old watch. The hinge held firm after all these decades. The surface bears small scratches from a life of pockets and hooks. The engraving on the back is almost gone now. The initials still shine, my father's. He used to hand it to me on calm evenings at sea and say, "Listen to this, Thomas. Hear the little heart. Time is the only judge you cannot bribe." He would press it to the railing, and the tick would travel into the bones of the vessel and keep company with the hull. Sometimes I thought the ocean ticked back. The tap upstairs gave a tiny protesting squeak as a hand that was not mine twisted it too far. The squeak stretched into a grind, a small hiss. Then the sound a toddler makes when he discovers a garden hose. Not a spray. A spill that wanted to become a river. I waited. Some moments grow clearer if you do not rush to meet them. The water subsided. Cabinet doors whispered open. A drawer slid. Footsteps returned as if nothing had happened. Evan set himself into his seat with the contentment of a man who has moved a chess piece and hidden the board. I reached for the pitcher and poured. The slice of lemon released oil into the air. I asked Robert about his work. He told me about supply chains and margins and the way everything now depends on numbers few people understand. He talked as a good man talks, to prevent a table from breaking. Marianne admired the woodwork again and meant it. When I stood to clear the first plates, Evan lifted his glass by the stem. "To weekend dreams," he said. I felt the old muscle of anger consider waking and then lie down again. I stacked plates. I walked the short length to the galley. The sink was dry the way I had left it, and the valve gleamed a little too bright. If you have lived long enough, you know the feel of a thing that has been forced. You know the shine of a scratch that was not there an hour ago. I brushed a fingertip along the base. The metal was warm. The handle had a new looseness in its throat. I did not sigh. I do not give people that satisfaction. I set the plates down softly and took the small kit from the locker. Wrench, sealant, spare gasket. Every captain is just a school custodian in fancier shoes. I loosened the collar and looked at the thread. The damage was fresh and deliberate. You could see the little crescent bites where a tool had been hungry. I felt the heat behind my eyes and cooled it with the memory of winters on the Atlantic when every fix was a prayer and a curse in the same breath. I tightened 2 turns and reseated the gasket. The drip receded. The handle settled. The quiet returned. Evan appeared at the edge of the counter wearing a face borrowed from a better man. "Everything is good down here. Rentals can be tricky," he said. I nodded as if grateful for the advice. "Might need to call maintenance," I said. He smiled kindly, and that was the worst part. "Good luck," he said. Weekends. The way he said weekends held a whole lecture inside it about men like me and how we should plan our amusements according to our means. I slid the wrench into the cloth and folded the cloth the same way a flag is folded. The motions mattered. They reminded me of who I belonged to. Not the crowd, not the performance, my own code. As I moved past the narrow navigation alcove, I let a fingertip rest for a breath on the panel that lived behind a plain door. Machines do not give you comfort. They give you facts. Facts arrive at the right time if you respect them. Back at the table, I set down fresh water and a new bowl of lemon slices. Grace touched my wrist. "Dad, are you all right?" "I am fine, kiddo." She searched my face for proof and then sat back as if she had found a version that would let her finish her meal. I pressed my thumb into the back of the watch and felt the old hinge hold steady. The marina settled into that soft hour when edges go gold and voices lower without anyone deciding to lower them. A gull traced a lazy arc and then doubled back. Robert lifted his glass halfway. "To patience," he said. He looked at me while he said it, and I knew he had noticed more than his son would ever admit. Marianne smiled, the kind of smile that forgives things you have not asked to be forgiven for. The valve in the galley released a last thoughtful bead. It fell with a tiny sound on the steel, and then it was quiet. I turned my wrist a little, and the sun found the old watch face and made it burn. Time is the only judge you cannot bribe. I let the light stay there and looked at the reflection until my eyes watered, the pleasant sting that tells you everything important is still alive. People think silence is weakness. They forget that silence is the language of those who have seen too much. I learned that language on steel decks that trembled under my boots and in engine rooms where heat rose like a prayer no one could hear. My life took shape there long before I ever owned a vessel or watched a man in a linen shirt weigh me with a glance and call it honesty. The quiet taught me how to hold a wrench so it does not slip. It taught me how to hold myself so I do not. I was a naval builder by trade and a craftsman by temperament. That is the closest way I can say it without telling the whole book of my working years. I spent decades crawling into spaces where larger men could not and coaxing stubborn machinery back into rhythm with a patience that felt like faith. The tools changed with the seasons. Big socket sets the size of a child's head, fine calipers light as a moth, grease that lived under fingernails for a week at a time. But underneath it all was a single rule that never failed me. The sea does not negotiate, it only reminds. When I met Lydia, she laughed the first time she saw my hands. She said they looked like maps, a palm of old routes and new miles. She worked at the base clinic back then with an apron full of pens and a habit of humming under her breath when she wrote down names. She would stand with me on the pier after her shift and squint at the horizon. One day she said this as if it were a grocery item we had forgotten to buy. One day give Grace something that floats not sinks. We have not had a daughter yet. We only had a plan that looked like two chairs facing the same direction. Grace arrived with a fierce little cry that embarrassed the nurse and made me grin. She was loud, and then she was quiet, and then she was both at once, as if the world already needed her to be two things that did not agree. The watch that belonged to my father lived in my pocket from the day it was born. I pressed it to her tiny back once while she slept on my chest and felt the tick through both of us. Time is the only judge you cannot bribe. My father used to say that. In those years, I believed him because I wanted to. When the fleet sent me farther than the edge of the calendar, I memorized Lydia's handwriting on blue paper. She wrote as if the words themselves were a kind of weather that could keep a man from rust. When I came home, she would meet me at the break in the chain link and we would walk slowly. Grace would run ahead and then stop to wait and then run again because that is how children learn the rhythm of trust. On weekends, I taught her the little things I had learned the hard way. How to coil a line without kinking it. How to read the wind by the way seagulls tilt their wings. How to take pride in a job no one praises. She did not love the smell of diesel, but she loved the water. It steadied her eyes the way a kind hand steadies a nervous horse. There was a stretch of years when everything we touched seemed to hold. The house did not leak. The car did not cough. I worked without needing to explain it, and Lydia made a home without needing applause. We were not wealthy, and we did not pretend to be. I grew a small workshop into something that fed families and sent younger men home on time for dinner. We built custom assemblies that solved problems no one else liked to solve. I showed up first and left last. I did not talk about it. That was the point. Trouble never sends a letter ahead. It knocks and expects you to guess who it is. Lydia's illness arrived like that. First a bruise that did not fade, then a word said too softly by a doctor with kind eyes, then the long narrowing that education gives where you can see the path by its shadows. We did not fight the way people describe it in magazines. We did the work. We measured doses. We learned schedules. I shaved her head with a scarf on my shoulder to catch the hair because she asked for neatness, and I owed her every neat thing a man can offer. Some nights she would lie on the couch and look at the ceiling like it held a map of where she was going. She would take my hand and speak in that low voice she used when she wanted truth without pity. One day she would say it again. One day give Grace something that floats, not sinks. I did not know if she meant a boat or a life. Maybe both. The men at my shop asked if I wanted to take time. I told them time takes itself. They kept the place running and I kept the lights on and the invoices correct. I brought home my worry like a lunch pail and set it by the door. Grace was old enough by then to understand without the words I refused to say. She cleaned the kitchen without asking. She carried baskets upstairs without a sound. The watch kept its beat in my pocket, and sometimes in the dead-weight hours it was the only proof that the world still clicked into itself. There were good days. We sat on the porch with blankets and counted the slow boats limping past the far buoy. Lydia would lean into me and stare hard like she could coax more days out of the sky. She never asked me to promise the thing you cannot promise. She asked for something else. When I am gone, she whispered one evening, "I want Grace to remember you near water, not inside a loud room. If you stay close to the sea, you will not harden. Give her something that floats." The final month was quiet. I learned the sound of her breath and the way it changed. When the last morning came, the light in the bedroom had that pale honesty that does not offer deals. I held her hand and laid the watch between us and listened to both beats as if I could tie them together. After the house filled with casseroles and shoulder taps, I put on my jacket and walked to the shore. The wind turned the surface into coins. I thought about what a life costs and what it pays. All that day and into the next, I said very little because language breaks if you lean on it too hard. Men in my position make obvious moves. They remarry too quickly or they buy a new car and call it therapy. I did not. I went to work and made every list twice. Then I made a decision no one saw. I sat with a lawyer who keeps his desk empty except for one pen and a calendar, and I signed papers that handed my firm to the younger hands that had trained under me. I took a fair price, and then I took another long walk. I did not announce it. I cleaned out my office and left the old stool. I kept the watch. I told Grace only that I was finished with the day-to-day. She nodded and hugged me and asked if I would finally take those classes on coastal navigation, the ones I kept putting off. I said I might, and we both smiled because we both knew what might means when a man is tired. I put the money where it could not be paraded, and then I waited. It is hard to explain this part without sounding theatrical. I did not want a trophy. I wanted a bridge. After the wedding, I felt her slide away inch by inch. Not because she stopped loving me, because life has gravity. 2 households, 2 calendars, 2 loyalties that tug in opposite directions. My son-in-law thought in straight lines, up or down, win or lose. He did not know how to sit in gray. I thought if I built a quiet place where the 4 of us could sit without armor, we might find our way back to something that felt like Sunday afternoons on the porch. So I began to visit marinas and showrooms and docks at dawn when salesmen drink their first coffee and the world has not yet rehearsed its smiles. If you have ever picked a vessel, you know it is not like picking a car. You are not buying speed. You are buying a room with windows for walls. I walked through that world like a man walking through a church without a congregation. I ran my hand along hulls and felt the language I learned as a young man rising in my throat. The Serenity did not seduce me with chrome. She won me with balance, the way her lines met the water, the way her fittings sat in their seats as if bored with perfection. The way the galley was laid out was for a man who liked things in reach and in order. I touched the helm and felt my shoulders relax in a posture they had forgotten. I stood by the berth where a family could sleep without rivalry. I watched light pool on the floor and I pictured Grace barefoot with a cup of coffee in her hand. I pictured Lydia laughing from a place I could not name. A salesman asked me something that did not matter and waited for my answer like a man waiting for a bus. I told him I had built ships and I liked the way this one stood. He showed me numbers and schedules and a date on a calendar. I nodded. I did not haggle. You do not bargain with the version of your heart that wants to keep a promise. When he turned his head, I took the old watch from my pocket and clicked the lid open. The second hand blinked staccato along its ring. I thought about the words Lydia gave me for free. Give her something that floats. There is a special relief in signing your name when the signature means more than the ink. I put my pen down and felt an ache in the center of my chest. Joy has weight when it is built on grief. I chose a berth in a spot where the wind misses the worst angles. I arranged for a security system not because I am suspicious by nature, but because the world rewards record-keeping. I asked the service crew to show me every compartment twice. I stocked the galley with quiet food that tastes like home. Salmon, lemon, dill. The same care I would have taken with Lydia's breakfast on the days she could eat. I did not tell Grace. I wanted that first step aboard to be a door opening between us, not a trap. I wanted a weekend with no performance, no speeches, no money sums thrown at the table like poker chips. I called it a rental so no one would put on their television faces. I told myself she would feel the deck under her feet and remember who she had been before calendars and egos rearranged the furniture. And so here we are. The weekend that was meant to mend us. Evan dragged a fingertip over polished metal like a man appraising a trophy. Grace kept rearranging small objects to avoid rearranging the truth. Robert and Marianne carried that stillness of people who have seen enough to refuse drama when they can. I held on to my old watch and listened to its patience. The light through the salon windows began to soften until the edges of things were less certain. The low run of the tide hummed under the planks. Far off, a horn called once and went silent. I could feel evening slipping its hand over the afternoon like a kind nurse pulling up a blanket. People think silence is weakness. They forget that silence is the language of those who have seen too much. I let the room settle. I let the last of the sun turn the brass into small suns of its own. The watch clicked in my palm. The hull answered in its old wooden murmur. Somewhere below, a single drop paused for breath and fell. The sound folded into the soft push of the water against the sides, and then into the quieter rhythm that waits under every room when daylight steps away. They arrived with sunglasses, perfume, and pity. Grace first with a canvas tote she did not need and a smile she hoped would glue everything together. Marianne was next careful with her footing, her hand tucked into Robert's elbow. And Evan was last walking as if the planks belonged to him already. He scanned the massed forest, the polished rails, the neat rows of lines, and I could feel him deciding what each thing meant about a person's lifestyle and status before he had said hello. I watched from the end of the pier with the access card tucked in my pocket. The dockhands had finished the morning washdown. The slip sign read transient in a neat font just as I had asked. A tidy piece of theater. You learn certain things if you have lived long enough. People reveal themselves quickest around strangers and borrowed shine. I had asked the office to issue guest fobs and leave the registration binder hidden in the drawer. Let the world look like a weekend trial so I could see my son-in-law without his company manners. Grace saw me and lifted her chin like a lighthouse. Dad, we found it. She kissed my cheek and then stepped aside so Evan could shake a hand he did not plan to shake. He took my fingers like a man trying an unfamiliar tool. Nice, he said to the air. He looked the vessel up and down as if an appraisal could be done with a glance. Didn't know Social Security covered yachts now. Some things are paid in full, son, I said, and felt Lydia's old sentence warm the inside of my mouth before it left me. Marianne exhaled a soft "oh" and let her eyes travel along the hull with genuine gratitude. The simplicity of the lines she said, looking to me for confirmation that she was not imagining it. I nodded. Robert gave the mooring cleat a respectful nod, the way a man nods to another man in church. He asked nothing and told me by that restraint that he knew how to walk through someone else's pride without stepping on it. The wind at the entrance pushed a faint salt into our clothes. Evan gestured toward the bow. So this is the weekend palace, he said. Must be a nice change from the house routine. He stood a little too close to the polished metal and caught his reflection, then smiled at the reflection more than at any person present. He drummed 2 fingers on the rail and the sound made a small hollow pulse. He leaned down to read the name along the stern. Serenity, he read, and then made a small sound that wanted to be a laugh but settled into a smirk. A whole lot of serenity for a pension. Grace hurried to distract with logistics. I brought the sunscreen and the motion bands. Remember when I used to get woozy? She said it lightly, and her eyes touched mine like an apology for something we had not named yet. I took her tote and set it in the cockpit. Your mother would have said, "Bring oranges," I said. She would have sliced them at the table so the smell would carry all over the deck. Grace closed her eyes for a breath. I wish she were here. We crossed to the gangway. Evan let me lead and still walked 2 steps ahead, like a man who cannot abide a pace he did not choose. His shoes were some city pair with hard soles, and the tap of them on teak sounded like a gavel. He paused at the power pedestal and made a show of checking the shore power cables as though to confirm we had plugged into civilization. The dockhand Jonah pretended not to hear and kept coiling the line with the right amount of curve. He caught my eye for a second and tipped his chin. "Everything is set, Mr. Reed," I answered with the smallest nod. The cover story was holding. The cockpit cushions gave that little sigh good leather makes when it meets a body. Grace sat and traced a finger along the stitching the way she used to trace the outline of tide pools with a stick. "This is beautiful, Dad," she said very quietly, as if speaking too loud would make the moment vanish. Marianne settled beside her and smoothed the corner of a blanket no one needed. Robert stood and faced the harbor like a man reading a book in a language he respects. Evan popped the latch on a locker without asking and lifted out a pair of fenders. He knocked his knuckles against one and grinned. "Premium everything." He pivoted to me with the smile of someone about to say something that felt clever in his head. "So, what did the concierge run you for the weekend I kept my eyes on the water?" "The dock office gave me a good rate," I said. He grunted at that. "Figures. Love how these clubs make sure folks feel included." He said included like it was a courtesy extended to the less fortunate. He stepped down into the salon and his footsteps went from gavel to drum on the stairs. I followed with the quiet intent of a man making certain a door is locked. He ran a hand over the galley counter and then pinched the edge as if the marble might come off. "Must be a thrill for you," he said. He opened the refrigerator and stared at the lemons and dill and 2 bottles of still water like he expected champagne to leap out and confess. "Most guys your age stick to lawn chairs and TV dinners. Good to see you changing it up." I let the words sit on the counter beside the knife. When you have raised a small business and survived a long marriage, you learn that every reply is a tool. Some fix, some strip threads. Pick carefully. I set plates on the table in that straight, true way that calms me. Grace wandered the perimeter with her fingertips grazing surfaces the way her mother used to test laundry on a line. She paused at the framed photo near the steps, a little girl with a gap-toothed grin holding a blue jacket and a paper boat. She smiled and looked at me. "Dad, you kept it." I said I did. Robert examined the chart at the navigation station without touching it. He recognized a course traced in pencil up the coastline. He cleared his throat the way men do when they want to praise without causing embarrassment. "Planning a little run to the cove tomorrow. If conditions are fair," I said. He nodded. Always the right answer. Evan stretched his arms wide as if measuring the room. He pulled out a dining chair and spun it an inch, and then another as if testing whether the weight of the chair matched his expectation of value. "Did you tip the valet?" he asked Grace without looking at me. She blinked. "We parked ourselves, Evan." He laughed in a way that mocked the idea of small economies. "Right. Of course." We carried the basket of bread to the deck to meet the breeze. The sun sat at a polite angle and the rigging all around struck faint music. Evan rested his elbows on the rail and surveyed the marina as if it were a landscape designed to flatter him. He pointed at a vessel 3 slips down and recited brand specs from memory. Then he listed the upgrades he would make if he had this one. Then he asked why there wasn't a larger tender on the davits. Then he congratulated himself for knowing the word davits. Grace hid a smile and then made it a cough. Marianne stared at the clouds and named them to herself. Robert set his hands on the back of a chair and let his shoulders rise and fall once. I listened for the sound beneath the sounds. Out at the channel, a horn gave one low, patient call that made the hair on my forearms lift not from fear but from recognition. I felt the watch in my pocket answer with its small metal heart. Evan found the camera dome in the corner and peered at it with suspicion. "Rentals love these," he said. "Keeps folks honest." He straightened and gave me that generous voice he uses when he wants to appear mentoring. "You know you can add yourself to a membership program, name on a card, access to all this comfort without the cost. Men like us do well with options. Men like us." The phrase drifted down between us and sank. I pictured Lydia tilting her head with that quiet, amused look that said, "Do not rise to bait that looks like advice." I set a glass of water by his hand and he kept speaking as if he had ordered it. Grace glanced at the stern again and our name there painted in a calm font kept its own counsel. The metal rail caught sunlight and threw it back at the water in a clean silver band. For a moment I saw Lydia's eyes in that reflection, bright and steady and pleased with nothing showy. The watch warmed against my leg. When Grace laughed at something Marianne said, she sounded like she had as a child, free of calculation, and the sound landed inside me like a small bird returning to a nest that had not burned after all. Evan cleared his throat loudly enough to reel the focus back. So what are we doing first? A spin past the lighthouse, a swing by the outer moorings. Show the neighbors how well we are living this weekend. He slapped the rail lightly with his fingertips. This is why I love coastal towns. Everything is on display. He held the smile one beat too long and then let it go with a shrug. I told him I wanted to start with a slow run inside the harbor to check the gauges. He looked mildly bored at the mention of instruments. He suggested we skip that for excitement. I said a man can enjoy himself without pretending the rules are decoration. He opened his mouth and then shut it again when Robert said, "That sounds sensible." Evan offered a little salute to the idea of sensibility. I noticed he did not offer it to me. Grace stood beside me and brushed an imaginary spot from my sleeve. She whispered, "If you get tired, we can sit." I said, "I am fine." The kindness in her eyes untied a knot I carry behind my ribs. She looked toward Evan and then back at me. "Thank you for arranging all this," she said louder this time. "He will settle once we are out there." I did not answer. The good water outside the breakwater would tell us more than I could. We cast off lines. Evan insisted on handling the stern and made a show of tossing the rope with a flourish that added a tangle. Jonah undid it without a word and handed the coil back cleaned and ready. Evan pretended not to notice. Marianne brought the extra cushions like a woman fixing a room no one has the manners to fix. Robert handled the bow with economy and a nod that made me want to shake his hand again. As I eased the vessel clear, the rhythm of the engine came through my hands like a memory. Every sound meant something, and all of it meant home. Evan's hard soles clacked a beat behind me. The noise marched up and down the deck until the sea breeze slipped in and softened it. The gulls widened their circles and the wind crossed the open water and took the edge off everything. I felt the watch tap twice against my leg as if to say, "Keep steady." The harbor opened like a book you know by heart, and we moved into the first line without hurrying. Nothing tastes colder than food served with pity. I felt it the second I brought the platters up from the galley. Heat rose from the dishes. The air had that early evening softness the harbor gives when flags along the pier lift and settle like quiet breath. Yet there it was on Evan's face before he even sat. That small curve at the mouth means a man is not hungry for food at all. He is hungry for approval, but he can withhold. I had set the table in the cockpit to catch the last of the light. Napkins folded with simple care. Plates were warmed in the oven so the chicken would not cool at the first breeze. Olive oil in a small bowl, bread that cracked neatly beneath a hand. Grace brought up the salad with a whisper of congratulations you would give a child for carrying something without spilling it. Marianne placed the candles and cupped her hands around the wicks. Flame took and held. Robert reached for the pitcher as if it were a ritual he respected. Evan arrived last with that brightness people use when their thoughts are already sharpening inside. He glanced at the spread and at the harbor and at his reflection in a chrome fitting, and then at me. Must feel good pretending for a weekend. I let the sentence sit like a stone dropped in clear water. Then I answered, pretending. You do it every day. Grace lifted her eyes to me the way a small bird lifts from a wire and then settles back when the wind stays steady. Evan laughed as if I had told him a good joke, and he did not mind being the punchline. He didn't mind. His ears went a little red. We passed the plates. Robert cut a single piece and set his knife down with that old-fashioned courtesy that tells you who raised a man. Marianne tasted and gave a tiny nod. Her gratitude carries no performance. She took time to notice the rosemary. She noticed the lemon tucked into the grains. She told me it was lovely and meant it. Evan pointed at the deck light above us. Nice touch, he said. He tapped the back of the chair with 2 fingers. Premium cushion. He carved his chicken as if measuring something else at the same time. He spoke to Grace but aimed it left of me. Your dad really leaned into this lifestyle. He grinned at his own sentence. A small pause. Then the next line. And on a renter budget. Impressive. Grace put down her fork with a sound so small only a father hears it. She tried to steer and asked if anyone wanted more bread. Robert asked a question about tomorrow's weather. Marianne told a brief story about a childhood picnic that blew away and made her mother laugh until she cried. The table wanted to be gentle. Evan needed it to be a stage. He pushed his plate away for effect. Let me guess. Marina's concierge handled everything. Packages for folks of modest means. He loved the phrase modest means. He rolled it around his mouth like a luxury he could afford to look down on. I took a sip of water and looked across the channel where a small craft eased back to its mooring without fuss. The way I try to move through rooms. Stop, Evan. Grace's voice tried to smile and failed. She reached for the candle and adjusted the wick. Fire jumped and threw a brief dance across the rim of my watch where it lay by my napkin. For an instant, the old brass face became an ember. It looked like an eye. It looked like Lydia was watching from wherever the tide of her had gone. The second hand ticked, and I felt the sediment of 20 years settle again into its groove. Evan leaned back. I can say what I want. Family right. He cut a small piece of chicken and chewed like he was thinking through the next line in a speech. He swallowed. Then he began to list the comforts around us as evidence that I had reached beyond my place. Stereo helm galley fit-out berth deck lighting mooring fees, service contracts. He said status without saying the word. He said means without asking a question. He said lifestyle as if it were an accusation. I did not argue the currency of anything. Instead, I asked if he would like more salad. He laughed. Save it for tomorrow. We can play Yachty again at lunch. He hit the T in that word the way a man hits a door when he wants to start a fight without getting caught. Robert cleared his throat. The sound had a little steel in it. He said the chicken was good and he thanked me for preparing dinner, and he looked at his son in a way that no one can mistake. Not angry yet. The step before it is when a man runs out of lines to give and starts thinking about the shape of a boundary. Marianne folded her napkin and unfolded it again. She asked me if I had always liked to cook. I told her I learned when long hours kept Lydia from the stove, and we learned to share that simple grace without keeping score. Marianne smiled with her eyes. She reached for the olive oil. Grace traced the seam of the table with her thumb. She did not look up. The wind shifted a degree or two, and the flags along the dock stirred. Shadows of those cloth triangles moved across the deck in quiet angles. I thought of all the rooms where proud banners have hung while smaller wars were waged under them. I do not like war language for tables. I like peace. Yet the air had that strange brightness arguments bring to the edge of a meal. Evan started again. Must be nice to step into comfort this late in life. He stretched the last 3 words and let them dangle, the way fishermen dangle bait. He wanted me to snap. I cut a small piece from the breast and put the knife down. The blade clicked on the plate. The watch answered with a soft pause and then resumed. Grace spoke. Maybe we could take a walk by the breakwater after dinner. She suggested a gift you hope someone will not refuse. Marianne agreed with a yes that sounded like please. Robert nodded and said the evening light would be fine for it. Evan shrugged and smiled at the harbor. He told us he preferred a crowd. He wanted to be seen. He lifted his glass. To borrow serenity. The rim hit the wood and made a bell sound. I did not return the toast. I was thinking of Lydia and the careful sentence she had given me to carry. Give Grace something that floats, not sinks. Sometimes the only way to keep a thing afloat is to take your hand off it and see if it remembers how to ride a swell. I took a breath and let my eyes move around the faces I love and the face I am trying to learn. On Robert there was patience. On Marianne there was worry disguised as editing the napkin fold. On Grace there was hope and fear standing too close together. On Evan there was an appetite disguised as wit. He looked at me and found what he wanted to find. A man he could dismiss. He turned the talk to finances without saying numbers. He asked Robert how long it takes to teach a retiree about modern markets. He told a story about a colleague who booked a luxury weekend on points and then posted as if he had bought the place. He said he admired honesty. He looked at me when he said it. He invited me to laugh with him at the idea of men who pretend to status. He was inviting me to laugh at myself. Instead, I asked Grace to hand me the platter. She did. Our fingers touched. They held for a fraction of a second longer than the pass required. Long enough to say, I am here. Long enough to ask, are you? She lowered her eyes and her voice when she thanked me. She did not step into the space I had held open between us. Not yet. The fast part of the evening had spent itself. The harbor took on that deeper blue that feels like velvet under a palm. Voices on other decks softened. A child laughed from a neighboring cockpit and the sound flew away. I poured water and watched the curve of it settle in the glass. Robert asked about my old workshop. I told him the younger hands were running it and doing well. He asked how it felt. I said it felt like putting a vessel you built in a fair wind and trusting it to hold its line. He smiled. He understood more than his son would allow himself to know. Evan checked his phone and held it face up so the light washed his features. He tilted it toward Grace and then tucked it away. He asked if the concierge had any evening events. He offered to call a friend with access to a private deck where the view would be better than ours. He described that view as if better views are purchased with proximity to other men who believe in better views. Marianne thanked him and said, "Here was beautiful." He answered with a sound that meant he disagreed, but he would allow the rest of us our little pleasures. I watched the candlelight climb the watch face in a small golden ladder. For one interval, the second hand seemed to hesitate. It did not. My heart did. That tiny illusion made me think of time the way sailors think of fog. It looks solid from a distance and turns to breath when you press into it. I let the room breathe. I let the pace ease into what it wanted to be now that the stage lights had dimmed. Evan spoke again, but the blade was dull now. He said something about early mornings, about harbor coffee tasting better than the city version, about the simple life he could see the charm. He meant the opposite. It did not matter. The wind pressed the flags, and they answered with a soft clap. The sound made me think of church and baseball and summers that did not end. Grace stood and gathered plates. I stood with her and carried them down to the sink. We worked side by side and did not look at one another except to pass. She whispered, "Thank you," so quietly that I almost blamed the faucet for the sound. I told her she was welcome. When we came back up, Evan had moved to the rail and was telling Robert about a plan to expand a project he believed would change his status for good. He listed the contacts he would use. He spoke the way young men speak when they are sure that being seen is the same as being respected. Marianne touched my arm. "Thank you for the evening," she said. She held my gaze an extra second that said more. That said, "I see what is happening here, and I am sorry, and I am on your side of whatever line must be drawn." Dishes done. Candles, lower, voices thinner. The knife in front of me tapped once as I set it down. Just a hair louder than it needed to be. It sounded like a gavel closing a session only I had heard. The old watch in my palm seemed to wait one breath before it decided to keep time again. I closed my fingers around it and listened to the harbor answer in its patient way. Some men break what they cannot own. You can hear it in the way they handle a thing that was never theirs, the grip too tight, the motion too eager, the satisfaction that arrives before the outcome. After dinner, the air softened and the flags along the dock moved like slow breath. Candle stubs burned low. Conversation thinned until even the plates seemed to rest. Evan stood and smiled at no one in particular. He said he would take a look below and stretched his arms as if shaking off something heavy. He went down the steps with his hard soles speaking for him. I did not call after him. I watched the harbor instead. A gull slid past with hardly a wing beat, and the channel made that patient sound it makes when the tide turns on time. Robert leaned on the rail with his fingers relaxed. Marianne gathered the last crumbs as if tidying could keep peace in the room by itself. Grace stacked 2 plates and then hesitated as if the next move would be a vote. She set them down again and folded her hands. Through the floor, I felt the small changes a man makes when he is not a guest, but a judge. A door opened that did not need to open. Drawers whispered. A cabinet answered with a sharper note. Metal against metal in a rhythm that understands nothing but force. I heard that little throat sound a handle makes when impatient hands wake it in the wrong direction. Then his voice low and pleased with its own stagecraft. "Let's see if the old man still fixes leaks." The hiss came next. Not the polite sting of a rinse. The raw release that becomes spray if you give it a second. A wet gasp. A rush. Then his quick hands were in a flurry. A towel was snatched. A pause. Water still thrusting into a place designed for calm. And then the valve seized where he had mangled its joint and the sound steadied into a stubborn stream that would not obey. On deck, Robert and Marianne glanced at me. I gave them nothing to add to their worry. The trick in these moments is to let a man finish his own mistake. Grace took a step toward the stairs and stopped when she saw my face. I went 2 steps down and turned into the navigation nook where the small black panel lives under an unremarkable door. Habit is a second spine. My hand found the hidden latch without looking. The screen lifted out of the dark like a lake catching moonlight. There he was, in the corner, camera jacket sleeves pushed back, mouth bent in concentration, both hands on the handle he had already loosened with a wrench he should never have chosen. He braced himself against the cabinet as if lifting a weight. Twice. 3 times. His shoulders did not belong in that posture. The fixture surrendered with an ugly cough. A line of water leaped across the sink and slapped the steel. He flinched and then smiled. He tested the damage with the back of his knuckles. He admired his work the way a boy admires a dent in a fence. He wiped the rim with a dish towel that had not been dirty until that second. He checked the floor for shining traces and dabbed at them. He put the tool away in the wrong drawer. He turned the handle again as if the thing would suddenly hear his intention and obey. The stream laughed at him. He shrugged at no audience and said something about rentals under his breath, the word curling in his mouth like smoke. Then he composed his face in the mirror of the microwave door, rolled his shoulders, and walked toward the steps with a posture he must think means concern. I put the monitor to sleep. I let the door close with the same quiet it always made. I waited 1 full breath before moving. The watch in my pocket ticked like a tiny metronome set slightly faster than the room around it. When I came up, Grace asked if everything was all right in that soft voice that knows the answer and prays to be wrong. I touched her hand. "Be with your mother-in-law," I said. "I'll check." Down in the galley, the stream was not a shout anymore, but it was not polite either. I took the cloth and pressed it along the base to see where the harm had chewed through. Bright shavings clung to the seam in a crescent. The joint had been twisted past the point where the thread remembers its path. I shut the supply under the sink for a moment and listened to the quiet find its way back. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the sound of things going where they should. Behind me, I heard a throat clear. Evan stood at the bottom stairs with a face borrowed from a better man. "Everything is good down here. Rentals can be unpredictable." He moved 2 steps closer and made a show of looking at the puddle as if he had only just noticed water exists. "Want me to help? I can manage," I said. He leaned against the bulkhead with his arms crossed. He wore that kindness some men wear that is really a dare. I set the cloth aside and took the kit from the locker. The small box had the heft of preparedness. Sealant. Spare gasket. The slim wrench with a bite that respects your intentions. I loosened the collar with a care that looks like slowness and feels like speed. Under the strain, the thread showed its new scars. I could patch it well enough to keep us calm for the evening. Later, I would pull the whole thing and replace what could no longer be trusted. For now, I wanted water to behave and tempers to cool in the space above. Evan said he admired people who could improvise. He told me about a friend who fixed a broken grill with a coin. He laughed like he had earned a memory. He asked how much the marina would charge us for a service call on a Saturday. He said "Nick" as if someone might pick my pocket while wearing white gloves. I told him I had seen worse on stormy nights in engine rooms that do not suffer pity, and I turned the handle gently to test. The stream slowed and then became a neat trickle, and then a single bead. It hung heavy, thought about itself, and fell. "Nice save," he said, as if he were the host, and I had performed an amusing trick for guests. He pointed toward the small camera dome in the corner. "Good thing these places keep eyes everywhere. Keeps folks accountable." He said accountable as if he were teaching a principle. He never looks at the places that could see him when he thinks he is alone. We stood there in the mild wet that remained. I wiped the steel and let the cloth drink what it wanted. I could feel his impatience waiting for praise or surrender. I offered neither. He said we should call it a night early. He said daylight makes everything better. He did not have a script for a room that refused him his applause. He climbed the stairs. His shoes found their hard rhythm again. I stayed a moment longer and listened to the joint. The small click and release it made when pressure changed told me how much it would hold and how long. My palms found the hinge of the old watch, and I let it open inside my pocket where no one could see. The little heart moved with the same stubborn faith it always had. Time is the only judge you cannot bribe. That sentence felt heavier in the damp air. On deck, the conversation waited for me like a table left set in a quiet house. Marianne smiled with that specific relief women have when a problem does not require more apology. Robert asked if the gauges looked steady. I said they did. He nodded once and returned his gaze to the harbor lights that had begun to appear in faint strings along the opposite shore. Grace looked at my hands and then at my face. She said thank you and stood a little closer without touching my sleeve. Evan brought up a joke about home repair and got himself a grin. He told the table that rentals always test your patience. He said the word always like a preacher trying to convince a reluctant congregation. He offered to clean up in the morning. He said he did not want the old man to strain himself. He laughed. No one followed. I sat and let the chair take my weight, and I felt the deck accept the new balance. The flags along the dock lifted and settled. Somewhere down the pier, a dog barked once and then thought better of it. A small cloud pulled across the fading blue, and the temperature dropped just enough to notice. The last of the candlelight climbed the watch face and turned the second hand into a bright shard that moved like a thin fish through shallow water. For one heartbeat, it looked like the hand had stopped. It had not. But the moment pressed itself on me in the way important moments do not, with thunder, with recognition. In my head, I walked through the next steps. There was no reason to hurry. Facts do not weaken if you let them breathe. I would keep the peace tonight. I would sleep on the gentle chop that comes in the hours after midnight, when even loud men finally let their bodies remember they are not the center of the map. In the morning, I would check the recording and save what needed saving, not because I distrust memory, because memory deserves a witness when the proud begin to deny. Evan leaned forward and asked about plans again. He wanted speed, he wanted spectacle. I said a slow run for the first minutes would keep us honest. He shrugged and let a small noise escape the sound boys make when their fathers say not yet. Grace brought coffee in mugs and the steam softened the edges of the scene. Marianne wrapped her fingers around the warmth and closed her eyes for one breath. Robert offered a modest toast to the evening without lifting his glass very high. I touched my mug to his in the smallest motion that still counts. The fixture below released another bead and then reconsidered. I heard it in my bones the way seamen hear weather inside the hinges of a door. The sound floated up the stairwell as a memory of what had happened rather than a demand to panic. The marina lights brightened. The wind slipped across the basin and cleared the taste of candle smoke from the air. The watch ticked louder to me now, though I knew its voice had not changed. Warnings do not raise their volume so much as they raise your attention. Some men break what they cannot own. They believe ruin proves them right. They do not see that the harm they cause is a mirror. Water does not care about insult or pride. It simply seeks the lowest point. Tonight it found a path a careless hand had offered it, and then it obeyed the first steady hand that convinced it to stop. Tomorrow it will bear witness in its own way. For now I let the last of the evening settle over us like a blanket pulled to the chin. I rested my palm over the watch and felt it keep its patient promise while the harbor tapped its quiet law against the hull. I had fixed warship engines in storms. A faulty tap was child's play. That thought steadied my hands as I stood in the narrow galley, the air still damp from the mischief that had tried to pass itself off as an accident. The fixture looked ordinary again, if you did not have the habit of seeing where metal tells the truth. Shallow scratches on the collar, a new looseness in the throat where the handle should have turned with the easy certainty of a well-made joint. I breathed once through my nose and let the room return to its original pace. No rush. Precision works best when it is not watched. I knelt and opened the little locker under the sink. The kit sat where I left it, wrench wrapped in a soft cloth, spare gasket in a small bag that rustled like a leaf. A tube of sealant with its cap clicked tight. I set them on the mat with the unhurried care I used when Lydia slept, and I did not want the light to change. My fingertips found the shutoff and eased it until the water line hushed. Stillness arrived in the chamber a breath at a time. The trick with a job like this is not the strength you bring to the table. It is the respect. You begin by listening. My thumb and forefinger sat on the collar, and I rotated as if turning a secret toward the light. The thread resisted with a memory of violence, and then yielded a fraction. I paused. Heat from the earlier strain clung to the fitting. I cooled it with a damp cloth and counted to 10. Again. A fraction. Pause. Patience is a tool, too. Evan appeared in the doorway with a face practiced for concern. He leaned on the jamb and looked at the mat and the kit, and then at me the way a man looks at a dog performing a trick. Might need to call maintenance, I said without looking up. He laughed that soft, empty laugh he keeps for moments when he thinks he is teaching. Good luck. Rentals never send help on weekends. I nodded as if we stood on the same team. He shifted and then retreated 2 steps, not wanting to risk his shoes. If he had stayed, the room would have felt smaller. Alone again, I took the collar down to the point where the cartridge could be lifted without argument. The piece came free with a small, sticky sound like a bandage removed too late. On the bench of my palm, I turned it under the light. The bite marks were there if you know where to look. Tiny crescents along the base where an impatient hand had grabbed and twisted with bravado instead of understanding. I touched the ridge with the edge of my nail. New metal shavings clung to the seal like glitter that had not yet found the floor. I set the old gasket aside and pressed the new one into place. The seat accepted it like a good chair and finally returned to a familiar house. A touch of sealant on the thread. Not much, just enough to help the metal remember itself. I started the cartridge back by hand. Tighten and back off a breath. Tighten again. Let the thread realign its memory in a series of small agreements. I wiped the base clean and watched for any trace of water. Nothing yet. Good. Up above, the voices of my family moved through their own slow drift. Marianne said something kind and let it float to the rail where the wind could carry it. Robert murmured, and the sound had that honest bass of a man who does not hurry to judge. Grace asked if I needed a towel and then stopped herself. She was learning which questions feel like love and which sound like a lack of trust. That is a hard lesson if you have married someone who confuses the two as a sport. I closed the shutoff halfway and listened. The line woke with a mild answer. I turned the handle at the fixture with the kind of pressure a person uses on a sleeping child's shoulder. The water came smoothly and clean and did not spatter. I shut it and waited. A single bead formed on the lip of the spout. It grew thoughtful and heavy and dropped with a neat sound. The seam stayed dry. I let myself exhale. The next work lived in the plan, not the wrench. I stood and dried my hands and let my mind lay out the sequence as an old sailor lays out lines before a weather change. Evidence first, then timing, then witnesses. No anger. Anger wastes torque. I opened the small panel in the navigation nook and woke the screen with a tap. The recording sat there in neat squares like windows in a city at night. I rolled back through the minutes until I saw Evan's shoulders at the galley again, the way he braced his foot against the cabinet, the way the handle jumped when he forced it past its own design. I paused the frame where his mouth made the satisfied shape of a boy who has chipped a stone wall and decided he is a mason. I saved the segment to a drive no larger than a postage stamp and slid it into an envelope I had already labeled with the date. I typed a short note in the log I keep for the vessel about routine service checks and a minor fixture adjustment. I included the time and a description of the marks observed. I did not add adjectives. Adjectives are the enemy of facts. The manual for the fixture rested in the bottom drawer exactly where it should. I opened to the page where the manufacturer lists acceptable torque and reassembly guidance. I took a picture with my phone. Next, I opened the marina site and captured the page where after-hours service policies are described in plain language. A note about response times. A note about security coverage in common areas. A note about liability when damage appears deliberate. I saved each to a folder with a name that would mean nothing to anyone else. When I came up, Grace met me at the top of the steps. Her eyes asked more questions than she said out loud. Everything I said. She nodded and the knot in her throat softened. Thank you, Dad. You always know what to do. Not always, I said. Sometimes I just know what not to do yet. Evan stood at the rail facing the marina lights. His profile could have been carved out of any college brochure about men destined for big things. He did not turn when I approached. He said he had texted a friend about a morning spot with better views and better people. He loves the word better when there is nothing to measure. I said to Dawn, "Here is fine." He shrugged as if to throw off the idea and tried a new pose. Robert asked how the gauges looked, and I said steady. He nodded and drifted into a talk with Marianne about an old trip they had taken on a ferry where the benches were hard and the coffee was perfect. Grace slipped her hand into the crook of my arm and stood that way for a time that could have been a minute or an hour. The sky took the color of pewter and then cooled to a softer gray. The harbor clicked its own rhythm under us. Somewhere a line slapped a mast twice and fell still. I keep the owner's folder in a drawer by the helm because I like to know where important papers live. I slid it open and pressed my palm to the manila the way a man checks a door to make sure the lock catches. Inside lay the Coast Guard registration, the insurance with my name printed plainly, where it must be the last service receipt, the note from the yard manager who called me an old-timer with a steady hand. None of that would be necessary yet. But when truth walks into a room, it should arrive with clean shoes. After the work, the ritual. I rinsed the cloth and hung it in the locker just so. I dried my hands with the towel Grace had warmed near the oven. The cotton took the water and left the skin ready to touch paper again. I folded the kit back into its place. Wrench last. The feel of that slim handle in my fingers never fails to lower my heart rate. It is a promise disguised as steel. Do your part. Tighten what should be tight. Leave what should move alone. Evan drifted close enough to talk without the others hearing. He said again that weekends make services slow. He told me a story about a past rental where everything went wrong and he had to call 3 times to get a response. He grinned at his own perseverance as if the lesson were about grit. I said perhaps we had avoided trouble this time. He told me not to be too sure. That last sentence hung in the air with a weight he did not feel. Grace drew me toward the cockpit table where the last of the candles waited with little lakes of wax around their wicks. She said quietly that the evening had been nice and that she hoped tomorrow would be quieter still. Her eyes flicked toward Evan and then back to me in a movement that asked me to read a whole page and summarize it in one nod. I told her morning is kind to people who let it be. The night leaned in at the edges and the flags along the dock surrendered to it. We sat for a while without a plan beyond breathing. Robert told an old joke as if it were new, and we laughed because the newness is never the point. Marianne touched my forearm and said the tea would help her sleep. I offered to boil water and then remembered the kettle is better on the stove below. I volunteered to fetch it, and the motion gave my hands something to do that did not end in a confrontation. When I went back into the galley, I let my palm rest on the countertop for a moment to feel for any tremor, any tiny tap from a drip returning to life. Nothing. The fixture held its peace. I lifted the kettle and filled it halfway and turned the flame until it whispered instead of roared. The blue rim circled the base like a ring around Saturn. Quiet work, quiet reward. On my way out, I took a last look at the panel in the navigation nook. I did not need to wake it. I knew what waited inside. I thought of the morning, of the sequence that would turn a boy's stunt into a lesson he could not laugh away. Witnesses who matter, evidence that does not waver, a room that has run out of polite excuses, not vengeance, a steady line drawn with a pencil that does not squeak. I returned to the deck with the kettle and the cups. Steam rose in ribbons that twisted into the wind and disappeared. Marianne wrapped her fingers around the heat. Robert thanked me with a small tilt of his head. Grace watched the light on the surface and pressed her shoulder into mine as if to borrow a little steadiness. Evan scrolled on his phone and smiled at something in a world he prefers because it always reflects him to himself. When the cups were empty and the air carried that clean late-night calm, I gathered the few tools that remained on the galley counter. The cloth folded around the wrench with a practiced whisper. I set the kit in the locker and turned the latch until it clicked. I wiped my palms one last time, not because they needed it, but because the gesture closes the loop. Then I lifted the old watch from my pocket as I reached for the locker door. The hinge on the box met the hinge on the watch lid, and both answered with a soft twin sound. The face caught a sliver of light from the cabin and flashed once like a lighthouse at the end of a long channel. Cogs and seals, ticks and tocks. Joints and threads are learning to trust their paths again. The room felt balanced. The plan felt quiet and sure. I closed the toolbox and felt the weight settle into the locker as if the vessel itself approved. The watch warm in my palm kept time with a patience I could feel in the bones of the craft. The moment had not yet struck, but I could hear it moving toward us with the clean certainty of a tide that knows its appointment. Cameras don't lie, but they do wait. They wait for the room to grow quiet, for the masks to settle, for the story to arrange itself into something a lens can understand. That was the thought in my chest as the harbor thinned to silver and the flags along the dock surrendered to night. The air cooled enough to soften the edges. Marianne held her empty cup in both hands like a small fire. Robert leaned on the rail the way men lean when they want to steady a table without lifting it. Grace stood close to me and let silence speak. Evan scrolled his phone until his own reflection agreed with him. I rose and let my hands rest on the back of the chair a breath longer than needed. An old habit. Give a room notice without raising your voice. I said we should clear up a small question before morning and invited them to the salon. Not a command, a courtesy that does not ask permission. Grace looked at me and nodded as if she remembered the rules of our house from long ago. Robert followed without fuss. Marianne set the cups aside and smoothed the tablecloth. Evan came last steps loud enough to say he did not expect anything to interest him. Inside, the dim light made the wood glow like a thought remembered. I sat at the navigation station and lifted the modest lid that hides the screen. The panel woke with a blue that reminded me of cold water. I did not hurry. I opened the log and touched the entry I had made. Routine check. Minor adjustment. I let them see that I keep records even when no one is watching. I said we had a small issue earlier and that I wanted to be sure the marina, not the guest, took responsibility if the manufacturer made an error. The words were plain as bread. No barbs, no accusation. A steady bridge is laid between facts and people. Evan smiled at the ceiling as if it were telling a joke. He said we could skip the drama. Then he said something about how rentals live with quirks. Marianne gave him a look that could pull a thorn without breaking skin. Robert folded his hands. Grace watched me and I felt Lydia's hand on my shoulder in that old way that meant keep your shape. I scrolled the feedback until the timestamp reached the quiet minutes that mattered. The camera in the galley came up its angle steady as breathing. The frame showed nothing dramatic, just a man alone with a shiny handle and the idea that no one sees him. I let the first seconds play. Evan shifted as if a draft had found him. He folded one arm across his chest. He glanced toward the steps, though none of us moved. The light from the screen climbed the face of my watch and turned the second hand into a thin white blade. For a heartbeat it seemed to stop. Then it kept time. In the clip, Evan tested the handle like someone testing a door he intends to kick. He turned it on. Water ran smoothly. He turned it off. The line went quiet. He looked toward the doorway like a child the instant before he stole a cookie. He set his jaw. Then he gripped with both hands and wrenched. The joint protested. He braced a foot and tried again harder. The handle jumped off its design and the stream leaped to the left with that hiss a sink makes when you have given it a story it did not ask to tell. No one spoke. You could feel the room counting all by itself. 1, 2, 3. Evan on the screen wiped the rim with a clean towel. He checked for shavings. He applied the towel again with the care he reserves for surfaces that might judge him later. He tossed the towel aside. He turned the handle like a man issuing a final warning to an enemy already prone. The stream laughed at him and kept coming. He shrugged at his reflection in the microwave door. The little self in the metal smiled back. He rolled his shoulders and walked toward the steps to perform concern. Then the clip ended. The sound that replaced it was not human. It was the steady push of the tide against the hull, a heartbeat sized up and made of salt. The salon, which had been a room, became a mirror. Marianne put a hand to her mouth. Robert lowered his eyes and then lifted them again to find the man he raised in the face of the man in front of him. Grace leaned forward like a branch bending toward water. Evan let a laugh escape that wanted to be bigger and died in his throat. He found a sentence and threw it like a rope. That is an invasion of privacy. He said it with the force of someone who believes naming a thing makes it true. So is arrogance, I said. My voice sounded like a winter morning to my own ears. Clear, not bitter. He started to explain. He said he had only checked for a function. He said the handle had stuck and he had attempted to adjust. He said the towel meant nothing. He said the recording angle made it look worse. He said his foot had slipped. He said we all knew these weekend vessels come with surprises. He said many things. None of them fit inside the frame we had just watched. Robert lifted one hand a little as if to test the balance of the moment. He said softly that the clip had shown what it showed. Marianne said nothing. She looked at Grace, a mother looking at a daughter across a river they had not crossed yet. Grace opened her mouth and then closed it. She swallowed like a person learning how to breathe through a wave. Finally, she said that the fixture worked before dinner. And then she stopped. The last part did not need saying. Evan pivoted to the law he thought he understood. He asked if it was legal to record in a private cabin. He said I should have told him. He said he could consult someone. He used consult like a hammer covered with velvet. I told him the system protects the vessel in case of theft or fire and that the sign near the helm states coverage in plain sight. I told him the feed exists to remove doubt when accidents begin to be called accidents. I did not tell him that shame is loudest when it discovers it has an audience. He stepped closer, palms open in that pose men use when they want to look reasonable and big at the same time. He said again that the tap was already faulty and that he had only tested it. I asked if he had used a tool. He said, "Of course not." The line broke on his last word. Robert flinched. Marianne looked at the staircase that led to the place where the harm had happened as if the stairs could confess. I kept my seat. I reached to the side and took the small envelope I had prepared and set it on the table. Inside the drive sat quietly. I told them I would file a notice with the yard if needed, and that I had a copy of the manufacturer's guidance for torque and reassembly, which did not include bracing with a foot on the cabinet. I watched the sentence land. No one moved. Grace spoke then. She asked Evan if what we all saw was what had happened. Her voice did not accuse. It simply asked to be spared a new lie. He tried to meet it. He almost reached it. Then his face changed. He said he had been frustrated and that things break easily when they are not maintained. He let frustration do the lifting that his apology should have done. He repeated that he had meant to help. That small word meant shivered as it left him. Marianne sat down. The sound of her dress against the cushion felt like the only true sound in the world. Robert looked at his son and said nothing for a long time. That silence did the work of a paragraph. When he did speak, his voice carried the weight of a father who knows he has run out of years to teach a boy to be a man. He said he was disappointed, and it landed like a verdict. Evan turned on me again, as if a new angle would change the geometry. He said a recording taken without warning is a betrayal. He said decent people announce things. He said many guests would be uncomfortable. I said decent people do not twist what is not theirs. I said the feed only waited because I had given him a chance to choose better. I said the truth is patient. Then I let the words stop. The light from the screen lingered on the face of my watch. I tilted my wrist and the glow slid across the glass until the second hand shone like a small spear. It felt as if Lydia was standing behind me, her hand on the back of my chair the way she used to steady me at wakes and weddings. "You do not have to raise your voice," she would say. "Just keep the beat." Grace asked if we could all sit for a minute. We sat. The small hum of the refrigeration unit filled the edges of the room. Distant laughter from another vessel crossed the open water and faded. In the corner, the manual lay open to a page that did not need a lawyer to interpret. I let my own heartbeat slow to match the one I could feel through the soles of my shoes in the hull. Evan tried a final path. He said we could let this go. He said it was a small matter. He said these things happen and called it wear and tear, as if malice can wear and tear. He said he would contribute to any parts if the concierge required it. He wanted to replace cost with currency and end the conversation in the language he speaks best. I looked at Grace and saw a young woman deciding in real time whether the man she married speaks any language she can trust. I closed the panel. The blue light dimmed until the room returned to itself. The tiny click sounded like a lock finding home. No one moved. We let the quiet do its work. The first slap of the incoming tide found the hull and made that hollow sound sailors know. Wood and water acknowledge each other in the old way. The sound repeated and settled into a rhythm. I stood last. I said it plainly. Tomorrow we will take a slow run inside the harbor. Then we will set things right in order and in truth. I walked to the rail and looked out at the lights braided along the far shore. They did not judge. They simply burned. Behind me, chairs shifted and feet found their way to the steps. Grace touched the back of my hand and left her hand there as if to say, "I am learning." Marianne passed with a nod that blessed the room. Robert paused near Evan and waited for his son to look at him. Evan did not. He stared at his shoes as if they belonged to another man. Cameras don't lie, but they do wait. They wait until a person shows himself. Then they tell the simplest story and let the tide speak for the rest. The hull took another soft thump and the sound traveled through the wood into the watch in my palm. The second hand kept moving. The night took a breath. The truth stayed. He said the owner should pay for that damage. I said he already has. The words slipped out with the calm of a tide that kept its appointment. No flare, no heat, just wait. Evan blinked like a man who missed a step on level ground. He tried to laugh and it came out thin. He repeated himself louder as if volume could build a bridge where facts had removed one. The owner should pay. Insurance exists for a reason. This is not on us. I picked up the folder I keep near the helm. There was nothing dramatic about it. Manila a little softened at the corners from being lifted and set back properly. Robert watched my hands the way an experienced reader watches a page turn. Marianne folded her fingers together in her lap. Grace stood so still that only the rise of her shoulders proved she had not become a photograph. It is not rented, Evan. It is registered under my name. I set the registration on the table and rotated it so the printed letters faced outward. The seal caught the cabin light. The number matched the one on the stern. I let the silence say it for me. He leaned in with the reluctance of someone sniffing medicine. He read my name and then looked up and then read it again as if I had learned some new trick of printing. "You tricked me," he said, but the sentence lacked air. "No, you revealed yourself. I did not need to add anything." He filled the space with his own breathing and the faint scrape of his shoes against the rug. Grace took a half step closer and then stopped. She looked at the document as if it were a door she had not known existed in her own house. Marianne closed her eyes for a moment. People do that when truth arrives, and they need to consult the part of themselves that chooses dignity. Robert cleared his throat and then did not speak. He knew to let the room do some of the work. Evan tried a new angle. He said names can go on paper, and still the concierge can arrange a bargain for those who want a taste of a life they cannot afford. He said membership programs love men who want to stand where they cannot live. He said he was glad I could experience all this comfort without paying a price. He glowed with the kind of kindness that cuts while it smiles. I lifted the small black pouch and tipped the key tag into my palm. Brass etched clean, Serenity, and beneath it, T. Reed. I set it beside the registration, then the slip agreement with the marina, then the insurance, then the letter from the yard manager who calls me a stubborn traditionalist with a steady hand. Paper is not theater. Paper is a mirror that refuses flattery. Grace lifted her fingers to her mouth. She did not cry. She made the small sound people make when the ground under them fits again for the first time in a long time. Marianne put her hand over Grace's knuckles, palm to palm, as if one steady pulse could teach another to keep time. Robert exhaled as if he had been holding his breath since his son opened his mouth in the salon 1 hour earlier. Evan lifted his chin. He said, "It does not change the matter at hand." He said the owner should still pay for the trouble. He said responsibility lies with whoever signed the purchase. His eyes kept darting to the documents and back to me. He wanted a new reality to begin before him without the small indignity of turning his neck. "I already has," I said that again. Then I let the sentence simply sit between us like a solid thing. I watched it become part of the room, not a flourish, a foundation. Evan turned to Grace as if she might pull a curtain and reveal the world the way he prefers. Grace did not move. She looked at me, not at him. "Dad, is this true?" Her voice was careful, but that carefulness loved me, not him. I told her it is. I told her I bought this craft in the spring with the intention of handing it to her family after a good weekend together. I said the words without ceremony. A father should not need trumpets to tell his daughter he had set a table for her future. A sound left her that was not speech. Her hands covered her mouth. She looked not at the papers, but at the deck flooring where her mother had once taught her to coil a line. Marianne whispered, "Dear God," and then pressed her lips tight for fear a heavier sentence might ride in behind the first. Robert stared at the certificate and then at the window and then back. I saw him taking inventory of what kind of man sits across from him and what that means for a household he cares about. Evan shook his head. "No one does that." He said it as if facts can be shamed into retreat. He said real people do not hide means. They display. They elevate. They create a world with the correct walls. He looked at me like a man looks at a locked door and accuses the key of betrayal. I did not argue policy with a boy who thinks spectacle is wisdom. I told him I wore old shirts and drove a modest car because tools are meant to work, not to shout. I told him generosity should land quietly. I told him this vessel was purchased with a promise I made to a woman who never asked for jewels. He laughed and said, "Men like me love poetry when we cannot afford truth." He did not see the paper on the table. He said again that the owner should pay. He said the concierge would charge. He said wear and tear is the way. He widened his hands as if to gather us into a chorus that would save him from being alone. I gathered the papers into a neat stack and returned them to the folder. Then I set only the registration back out simple and plain. Facts do not improve with repetition. They wait until a man chooses the shape of his reply, and then they rest there, unbothered. Robert finally spoke. He said, "Thomas, thank you for telling us." His voice had the timbre of steel with paint on it. Marianne looked at her son and asked him whether he had anything honest to say. Evan said he had made a mistake and that he regretted any inconvenience. Inconvenience. He trimmed the word as if he were cutting a hangnail. Grace turned to Evan. Her voice had a private softness I remember from when she tried to rescue wounded birds. "Did you do that to the valve on purpose?" He began to deny and then ran out of tone. He said he was frustrated. He said he tested a handle. He said we all saw what we wanted to see. She looked down. She whispered to herself that she did not want to see any of this. Then she looked at me, and I watched a hinge move inside her. "Dad, why did you not tell me sooner?" "Because I wanted you to step onto something that felt like home before you knew its cost," I said. "Home feels different when a price tag dangles from the kitchen." Evan said, "So you had a point to prove." I said no, I had a hope to keep. He frowned as if the grammar offended him. He said I had staged a test and called it love. He said I had tempted him. He said men like me set traps for men like him because envy is a small room. He had all the lines pre-written and none of them fit the furniture. I let him finish. I watched the seconds move across my watch face. The light from the instruments touched the glass and turned the moving hand into a slender blade again. It traveled around the ring without hurry. Lydia used to say, "Keep the beat and the song will take care of itself." I kept it. "This craft was meant for you," I said to Grace, "not as a trophy, as a place where patience and time could put their hands on your shoulders. Lydia asked me to give you something that floats. I meant to do that in the morning." She listened without a breath. Her eyes held a shine that was not tears, yet just that edge where salt begins. Evan gathered himself for one more play. He said if the gift was real, it should not depend on any test. He said the noble thing would be to follow through and not make a scene. He tried to move the whole story to a place called noble where he could live comfortably. He still believed volume could shear bolts. "There will be no scene," I said, "only daylight. We will run inside the harbor where even loud men lower their voices. Then we will do what truth requires." The words made no promise beyond gravity. He did not like a world where he could not negotiate with physics. Grace reached for the key tag. Her fingers hovered a hair above the brass. She did not touch it. She looked at me and asked without words whether the door that had appeared might still be open after the night. I did not answer with a sentence. I let my face tell her I had not decided. Love that lasts does not rush. It waits for the soul to be ready to carry a weight without breaking. Robert stood and said he needed air. He stepped to the entry and lifted his face into the salt. Marianne rose more slowly and looked at Evan with the tender grief mothers of sons reserve for seasons when the boy they raised seems to be visiting from a worse address. She said 2 words. "Be decent." He said he was always decent. She did not argue. She simply let the sentence sit there and fail. I closed the folder and slid it back into the drawer. My hands knew the weight of it now the way they know a spanner that fits perfectly. I pocketed the key tag, too easy a target for a man in a mood. I lifted the old watch and pressed the lid shut with my thumb. A small click sounded hardly louder than a breath, but it cut through the cabin like a line drawn clean across a page. The air changed. The light lost its blue and took on a gentler color from the lamps. You could feel the room agree that this chapter had placed its period. We moved back onto the deck because the deck forgives. The basin beyond the slips had turned to black glass. The flags along the pier hung still as if the whole shore had stopped to hear whether we would choose tenderness or theater. Evan stood apart and stared at the marina lights as if they had betrayed him. He said very quietly that I had embarrassed him. I said, "No, you did that." I did not add anything else. He watched the water as if it were a jury. Grace came to my side and linked her arm through mine like she used to when we crossed a street. She leaned in and I felt the old length of her shoulder against me. "Thank you, Dad." The words carried weight and sorrow and a small spark of something that might yet be joy when time finishes its work. Robert returned and stood with us. Marianne stayed near Evan because a mother does what she can even when what she can is only to keep company with a man who prefers his reflection. He said again that the owner should pay for the trouble. I said he already has, and the sentence finally sounded to him like what it was a bell struck once in a clear morning. He looked at me, and I saw him consider a world in which he is not the bell. He looked away. The night did what night does. It settled its shawl over the marina. The deck boards cooled under our feet. A distant bow wave sighed against the breakwater. I felt the watch warm against my palm. Power does not require a spotlight. It prefers a clean room at the right hour. Truth had its hour. I had closed the lid on it for the night. In the morning, the rest. It is easy to lose money, harder to lose respect. You managed both. The sentence lived in my mouth before the sun cleared the roofs along the marina. I let it sit there and warm like the first cup of coffee. I did not want to use it. I did not want to need it. But some truths prepare themselves overnight while a man sleeps. Dawn slid into the basin without colors at first. Pewter then, a low wash of rose that had to fight for itself. Flags barely stirred. The deck held the chill the way an old porch holds a story. I checked the gauges and the line where the seam had been asked it to behave. The joint kept its promise. Not a bead. Good metal respects quiet commands. Up above, Robert stepped softly, a big man learning the weight of caution. Marianne wrapped herself in a shawl and kept her words to a kindness or two. Grace stood with her hand on the rail as if the rail might answer. Evan arrived last with a brightness on his face that belonged to a different room, the kind of cheerfulness that is really a plan. We eased the craft off the slip and made the slow run I had promised. Inside the harbor, the water glossed over our reflection and handed it back without judgment. The engine breathed like a tired animal that knows its job and does not boast. Evan tried to turn the morning into a spectacle, and the morning refused him. He pointed once at the lighthouse and then fell silent when no one built a stage around the gesture. Grace stood near the helm and said nothing. The wind lifted a strand of her hair and laid it down gently like a nurse adjusting a blanket. When we returned to the berth, the lines came home easily. Jonah on the dock passed the aft, and I took it without fuss. He scanned our faces and read the weather there better than most men read the sky. "Everything is all set, Mr. Reed." I said yes, and he nodded as if he had mended something important simply by being decent. I asked everyone to sit in the salon, not a command, a request with the weight of an old habit. The wood held last night's warmth, and the morning light entered at a new angle, softer, as if the room had turned its cheek. I took the folder from the drawer and kept the lid closed for a breath. I thought of Lydia and the way she would touch the back of my neck when a decision had hardened in me. "Keep your shape," she would say without sound. Evan leaned back and set his ankle on his knee as if the posture could decide outcomes. He said we should put last night down to nerves and move on. He said tension wastes a weekend. He gave the word weekend a gloss as if it were the only time that counts. Robert set both feet on the floor and folded his hands. Marianne watched Grace and waited for her daughter to find a path worth walking. I opened the folder and lifted out a single envelope. I had sealed it 2 days ago with a steady hand and a feeling I did not trust. I felt again the ache of that decision. A father reaching across a river with something he has built and wanting it to be received as the simple bridge it is. I lay the envelope on the table. For a moment, no one breathed. "This was meant to present the vessel to your household," I said, "not to decorate your lifestyle, to give you a place where time could speak without being shouted down. It was ready for this morning after a clean run and a quiet breakfast." Grace looked at the envelope as if it contained another version of herself. Evan looked at my face. He started quickly, eager to catch the wheel before it turned. He said he had slept badly and that he had considered everything and that he respected my efforts. He said responsibility is complex. He said he handled stress poorly sometimes because pressure makes diamonds. He said nothing about the feed. He said nothing about the towel. He said nothing about the 2 hands on a handle that was never his to command. He kept lifting words like they were weights and dropping them back into the rack without form. I waited. Patience is not delay. It is a choice to let gravity speak. When his sentences ran out of air, I slid my thumb under the envelope flap and broke the seal. Paper sighed in that small way it does when it knows it is being asked to perform the last duty of a promise. I took out the document. It contained my name written the way a man writes when his hand still remembers the ache of learning to sign with care. It contained a date that would have given today a second birthday. It contained lines that would have moved ownership of a home on water into the life of my child. Grace saw enough. Her hand rose a little in the air and then lowered back to her lap. Dad, I did not know. The words were not defensive. They were a confession trying to be born. You did not want to. My answer sounded gentler to my ears than it reads on a page. I did not mean cruelty. I meant the simple line between ignorance and refusal. She closed her eyes and took a breath that shook and then steadied. I watched a hinge move inside her. The room waited with her. Evan tried another move. He said a generous man would follow through no matter what. He said conditions ruin nobility. He smiled as if he had landed a clean strike. I thought of Lydia folding towels with a care that had nothing to do with anyone watching. Nobility is not a show. It is where you put your hands when no one is looking. I took the paper by its edges. I had worried that my fingers would tremble. They did not. The watch in my pocket kept its own small rhythm and lent me some. I said nothing. I did not give a speech. I let the sound do the work. The first tear moved down the crease like a coastline on a map. The next tear was cleaner. By the time my hands met in the middle, the strip that held the page together came free with a sigh, and the two halves separated. The sound crossed the room and met the low push of water on the hull, and for a breath, they were the same sound paper and tide agreeing that a thing had ended. Then the wind through the open hatch took the pieces and flattened them into quiet. Grace made a low sound that held regret without drama. She covered her mouth with one hand, her shoulders rounded and then straightened. I saw a woman deciding to stand up in her own name. Marianne did not cry. She reached across and set her palm on the table as if she could keep faith from sliding off. Robert looked at Evan and then at me. He gave the smallest nod a man can give and still mean it. Evan stared at the halves. He reached for a word and found none that would work. Then he found a strategy. He said money does not matter between family members. He said I could not take back an offer that had been extended. He said I would regret it. He said people would see me as petty. He said many things in a row as if Rose could rebuild a house that had already fallen. I did not argue about currency. I said respect is the only tender that holds its value. I said you spent it last night on the price of a laugh. I said the account is closed. He called me dramatic. He asked Grace to speak. He asked her to fix what he had broken. He said Dad is wound tight because the craft is a symbol and symbols live in old men. He tried to turn the room into a place where pity could operate as glue. Pity is a poor carpenter. Grace lowered her hand. She wiped her eyes with her wrist like a girl who used to run on beaches and come back with sand all over her knees. She looked at Evan the way a person looks at a hill they have climbed too many times. Evan, I saw the recording. He opened his mouth. She lifted a finger and he closed it. She said she had given him her silence too often because the cost felt lower in the moment. She said the bill had arrived. She stood. She walked to the bin and dropped the halves of the document into it and looked at them the way you look at a picture that used to make you happy and no longer does. She did not cry anymore. Marianne whispered a prayer so simple it did not need a church. Robert drew a slow breath and let it out. He said, Thomas, I am sorry. He said, I wish we were not here. He was not asking for a reversal. He was mourning a path that had closed. I told him sorrow belongs not apology. He nodded as a man nods when he respects the furniture in a room he did not arrange. Evan spoke again, quieter now, the volume he uses on investors who will not return calls. He said we could make it right. He said he would pay for a new fixture. He said he would file whatever forms I needed. He said we should not let a rental weekend ruin a family. He could not stop using words that did not fit. He could not stop calling it something it was not. I stood and the chair legs made that honest wooden sound men listen for when they remember to respect a floor. I said you would gather your things. I will have the marina call a cart. You will leave this deck before noon. The vessel will remain where it belongs. There was no anger left in me, just the line that marks a shore. He asked if Grace was coming. The question hung between us like a damp coat no one wanted to touch. Grace answered by sitting back down beside me. She set her hand on my forearm and kept it there. She said, I need time, not from my father, from the noise in my life. Evan stared at her as if the room had turned upside down. He tried a smile. It did not know where to sit on his face. He left to pack. His shoes tapped down the steps and the sound faded. Marianne went after him because that is what a mother does in the absence of better tools. Robert stayed. He walked to the window and looked out at the light braided across the water. He stood with his hands behind his back, a man counting years and calling each one by its name. Grace did not look at me or at the bin. She looked at the watch in my palm and then up into my eyes. She did not ask for the paperback. She did not ask for mercy I could not afford. She said, "Dad, I am sorry." I told her apology is a poor substitute for listening. She nodded. I could see that she wanted to say 1,000 sentences and chose to carry them instead of dropping them at my feet. The marina sent a cart and then a second. Evan and Marianne loaded bags with the false drama of people who believe loudly speaking repairs what speech ruined. Robert said he would stay if I would have him. I said, "Of course." Grace touched her mother's shoulder and whispered something that loosened Marianne's face for a second. I could not hear it, only saw the way a woman receives love she fears is too late, and then decides it is not. Evan paused at the gangway. He turned as if to deliver one last line that would frame this day in a way he could live with. None came. He looked at the registration on the table. He looked at the key tag in my hand. He looked at Grace standing beside me. He swallowed. He walked down to the dock and did not look back. The wind freshened and took the last of the paper smell from the room. The halves in the bin lay quiet. They were only fibers now, no longer a promise waiting to be signed by the morning. I lifted the watch and listened to its steady voice. The little heart inside kept going, and the rhythm put my own heart back where it belongs. Robert poured a small glass of water and handed it to me. We stood. The three of us watched the marina for a moment that lengthened until it became peaceful, trying on its clothes. Kindness does not seek revenge, it chooses distance. The offer had been withdrawn, not to punish, to protect what it was meant to honor. Outside, the tide turned on schedule and pressed a little harder against the hull. The sound met the quiet rip of paper already finished, and the two became one story that the wind carried off the deck and into the day. At sunrise, the coffee did not taste like revenge. It tasted like clarity. I watched the kettle sigh and settle. Steam rose in thin ribbons that drifted into the open light and thinned to nothing. The basin lay smooth as an ironed sheet. Flags along the pier hung heavy, then lifted a finger as the earliest breeze found them. I poured, and the aroma moved through the cabin like an old hymn sung under the breath. The first sip was clean. It carried no score. Only a small heat that steadied the hands. Robert was already on deck. He stood with the stillness of a man who has learned to make peace with early hours. He nodded when he saw me. No words yet. We let the sound of the harbor do the speaking. Ropes creaked. A gull called once and wheeled away. Somewhere far off, a diesel coughed to life and then remembered itself and settled into a low run. I handed him a cup, and he took it the way a person receives something they swear they do not deserve, and then allow themselves anyway. Grace stepped up from below, wrapped in a sweater she had found in the locker. She did not say good morning. She did not need to. Her face had that new morning softness grief sometimes brings after a hard night. She curled her hands around the mug and looked out at the mouth of the harbor where the water bends around the breakwater and continues as if nothing on land could change its mind. I thought of Lydia and the way she would tilt her head and find me in a room without moving her feet. I could feel the old watch warm against my palm. I flipped the lid open with my thumb. The second hand ticked as if it had been waiting at the door. The glass caught a bar of sun and turned it into a quiet coin. I held it a moment longer, then closed it and let the hinge make its small sound. The sound felt like a gentle conclusion, not an ending, a pause that knew where it belonged. The dock cart rolled to a stop on the pier, and for an instant I expected more luggage and more noise. Instead, I saw Marianne climb down with a paper bag from the bakery. She was alone. She set the bag on the bench by the pedestal and looked toward us with a question on her face. The question was simple. "May I come aboard?" I nodded, and she walked the gangway slowly, careful with her balance and careful with her heart. She said she had found a morning without shouting and thought she would bring something sweet to see if the day wanted it. She said she left a note at the inn. She said she would not stay long. I told her she was welcome as long as the kettle stayed warm. She smiled at that, a thin smile but honest. She sat beside Grace and touched her shoulder and did not press words into her. We ate rolls that flaked neatly and left crumbs in a pattern like small islands on the plate. Butter softened and disappeared. The sun slid up from pewter to gold. The craft seemed to take a deeper breath as the boards warmed. Robert lifted his cup a few inches and looked at me with that kind gravity he carries. Some inherit money, others inherit wisdom. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Only one lasts, I said. He gave a short nod and let his hand lower. Marianne wiped a crumb from the corner of her mouth with the back of one thumb. She told me she was sorry for yesterday, not for the day itself, for the way a mother can end up holding both sides of a rope and burning her hands and calling it duty. She said she would not ask me to change the line I had drawn. She said she came to sit with whatever truth would allow. I thanked her. I told her the morning had already thanked us all by being kind. Grace turned her cup slowly and watched the line the coffee left on the porcelain cling and then slide. "Dad," she said, "I do not know what the next thing is. I only know it needs to be quiet for a while." I told her that a quiet room will take care of her if she makes the bed and opens the window. She managed a laugh that did not force itself. She asked if I would teach her to read the tide tables again. Not today, not as an assignment. As a way to sit together with a language that does not shout. I said yes, and I felt something old and good stand up inside my chest. The marina stretched its arms. Workers moved hose lines and waved without names. The world had its tasks. We had ours. I checked the gauges one more time out of habit and because the small acts keep a man in shape. The number that mattered most was not printed. It lived in the way our bodies remembered how to be near one another without flinching. I felt that the number steadied itself. Robert told a story about his father teaching him to tie a bowline and how the knot looked like a miracle until his hands learned the logic. He said the older he gets, the more he trusts knots he can untie. He looked at Grace. He told her she did not owe anyone a permanent answer today. Marianne squeezed her daughter's fingers and left her hand there a breath longer than comfort requires. That extra breath made all the difference. I brewed a second pot and the aroma rose again, softer this time, as if the room had learned how to hold it. We did not speak of Evan. Silence does not hide. It proposes better work. Marianne looked toward the inn and said she would go back soon and make sure he had what he needed to leave for a few days. She said it as a mother and as a woman who had decided to stop dressing in certain acts in Sunday clothes. She stood and touched the rail with her fingertips, the way one touches a piano before sitting down. "Thank you for this morning," she said. She looked at Robert and then at me, and then at Grace. "It is not my place to bless another woman's daughter, but if it were, I would bless you with a season of still water." Grace nodded, and for a second she looked 10 again, standing on a dock with a life jacket too big and a grin too bright for the frame. When Marianne reached the end of the gangway, she turned and lifted the little paper bag and shook it as if to show the morning one last piece of kindness. Then she was gone, and the sound of the cart mixed with the gulls and wore itself thin. Robert stayed. He stood at the bow with me for a while and watched the small traffic of the basin. Workboats nosed out. A man and his granddaughter puttered past in a skiff, both wearing orange foam and both leaning forward at the same angle. He said he used to think knowledge was a stack of books. Now he thinks it is a way of standing. He thanked me without telling me for what. I told him nothing had been asked for. He said that was the point. Grace brought the tide charts from the drawer and spread them on the table inside. The paper made that soft sound of maps that have been folded and unfolded with care. We bent our heads together. I showed her how the moon speaks to water, and how water learns to keep an appointment even when the wind tries to tell it otherwise. She traced the columns with a fingertip. She found our harbor. She found our time. She looked up and smiled, and some of the tiredness left her face. There were things unsaid that would remain unsaid, not because we feared them, because we had chosen the right scale. A man does not drill the hole to prove he owns it. He learns the vessel mines quietly and then thanks it for the ride. The same is true of love. I believed that more this morning than I did last night. We took our cups back to the deck. The sun had climbed to a place where everything began to show its edges again. The wind drew small gold wrinkles on the water and then smoothed them with a passing hand. I felt the old watch turn warm on my skin. I lifted it and let the light pass through the glass and onto my palm. The glow lay there without burning. I kept my hand open and steady until the beam moved on. The second hand kept its small, reliable promise. Robert cleared his throat. "To character," he said. He spoke it without ceremony. Grace lifted her cup and touched it lightly to ours. Marianne was not there to lift hers, but somehow the air held her amen. We drank. The swallow was easy. I gathered the plates and remembered to be grateful for the way dishes return you to the ground. The cloth took crumbs and left wood. The kettle sighed again when I rinsed it and set it on the rack to dry. The cabin held the smell of coffee and flour and salt. The deck held the sound of water against wood. I pressed my palm flat on the table and felt the hull answer. Grace went below to change, and the small sounds of her moving through drawers felt like a lullaby written for a house that floats. Robert stood at the rail with his hands behind his back and watched the harbor approach its daytime pace. A horn sounded once and fell away. Somewhere a line snapped taut and then settled. The world worked. I took the watch out one more time and let the lid rest against my fingertips. I thought about the circle that had brought me to this morning without asking permission from pride or shame. I thought about a woman who asked me to keep my daughter near water when she had to go where I could not follow. I thought about how ordinary the tools of resolution look when they finally finish the job. A cup, a chart, a hand on a shoulder, a sentence spoken without hurry. The sun moved again, and a thin bar of light fell through the opening and crossed the face of the watch. The tick and the hush of the hull came into time with each other for a breath, then parted and continued polite neighbors. I closed the lid, and the little click landed in the room like a promise kept. The last of the coffee cooled. The morning finished changing its clothes and became the day. We sat with that and did not hurry to stand. The craft rocked once, as if nodding along. The sound of the tide rose and fell, a low chant, patient and old. Light slid through the glass on the hatch and found the watch again, softer now. The camera of the world would have had nothing to sell in this moment. No argument, no confession, only wood, water, sunlight, and a family learning to breathe without a performance. When we finally moved, it was because the day asked to be honored with small tasks done well. Lines checked, knots retied, charts folded along their old seams. The deck welcomed our weight. The basin answered with a bright slap against the bow. The kettle dry now rang a faint ring when I set it down. We stepped back into the quiet rhythm that would carry us. Then the sound of the waves on the hull and the beam of sun through the watch took the scene and drew it to a close. Not with a curtain, but with a soft fade no eye could see, only the heart could feel. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on screen.